Hello, everyone. Welcome to all our viewers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for wherever you're calling in from. We'd like to thank you for joining us on our webinar today. It's all about high-margin S3-compatible services for cloud service providers. We're together with Veeam, Cloudian, and Evros Technology Group. I'm Naresh Chauhan of Cloudian, and I'm the EMEA Marketing Director. Joining us today are Michael Cade, a Global Technologist from Veeam, Adam Dagnall from Cloudian, and Stephen Seagrave, Solutions Architect from Evros. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Adam. Welcome, Stephen. Good to see you today. Our agenda today will be broadly based around how solutions from Veeam, Cloudian, can provide managed service providers with a range of new high-margin S3-compatible services. We'll be broadly covering the following topics. An introduction and an overview from Veeam around the different service categories with demonstrations on various new services that can be implemented and how easy they are to manage in a multi-tenant environment. An introduction to Cloudian and our Hyperstore S3-compatible object storage solution for high-capacity unstructured data storage. And then a view from Stephen Seagrave of Evros, a leading-edge service provider, on how they've implemented these services and some of the benefits that they're seeing from that. With that, we'll start off the presentation. So we're facing a new world order today, really, in the sense that there has been a changing in architecture, in the way we reach customers, and the different business models deployed in between. The main challenges on the next slide show that there are growing storage requirements all over the world. Applications such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things are generating vast amounts of data. Within the backdrop of that, there is complexity, not only in terms of the pressures on the business, but also the different political and geosocial requirements that we have as well. So that not only puts pressure on the overall infrastructure, but also puts pressure on the challenges in terms of the differences we see between geographies. In the United States, we see scalability as an issue. In Europe and the Middle East, we often see security as an issue. And in India and Asia, we often see performance and accessibility as a key issue. So managed service providers are challenged with trying to provide a scalable architecture that's ever growing and ever creeping, and that's not predicted to stop anytime soon. So although growth is great for business, it can be bad for operational efficiency, especially if you're resource constrained. Many environments are operating with time and resources stretched to absolute limits. Hence, selecting the right solutions to grow with you and the needs of the business without disruption or painful migration is really important. And then security is a key concern. Because of the regulatory requirements placed on many organizations, the continual threat of viruses, ransomware, or hackers, it places a lot of pressure on managed service providers and cloud service providers. In the past few months, we've seen lots of examples where companies such as Travelex and other large publicly known companies are facing ransomware demands and are having to pay out vast sums of money. So we're trying to protect you from that. Last but not least, if you're a managed service provider, then you're aware of the shrinking margins that exist. So studies show that while data growth increases, new revenues and new MSP services are rising at the rate of 42%. But profit margins are actually, so there is a requirement to differentiate. On the next slide, you can see effectively the biggest disruptors, and this is from a recent ESG market forecast where the biggest disruptors are seen as the cloud, technologies such as AI and cybercrime. So, of the respondents that were participating in the survey, 74% said they had a need for cloud backups and on-premise workloads and on-premise backups as well. 23% of those respondents actually sort of said, they expected that to be in the cloud. But for the regulatory requirements, many organizations and enterprises, whether they be private or public sector, cannot put their data on the cloud. Okay. And on the next slide, which is very briefly sort of showing what was the key concern that most people had and what was the key use case that people saw. So they saw, both private cloud and public cloud as being backup and archiving. And the forecasted demand for that is getting huge. On the next slide, you can see that from various different types of services and applications, the overall market is predicted to grow, to 15 billion in 2020 alone. So that's just a brief overview of the market. I'd like to now hand over to Michael Cade for the section on Veeam. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, cheers, Naresh. Hopefully sound is all good here. So the focus really about what we want to talk about and what we want to run through is obviously a massive focus around object storage, but in particular about how object storage could be an opportunity for our VCSPs, which is what we have as our MSP partners, but ultimately how can you wrap around a service to offer object storage with Veeam out to your existing Veeam customers or new Veeam customers. So I want to just talk about, there's three scenarios and let's get straight into what that actually looks like. So to begin with, we're going to just very briefly touch on what is ransomware. I'm sure everyone has read the news recently over the last 18 months and is very much aware of what ransomware is. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to get into, okay, so where can we leverage object storage from a Veeam point of view to store our long-term backups, or at least just a copy of that backup in object storage, and obviously namely Cloudian for that matter. And then also we're going to talk about finally the Veeam backup for Office 365 and the ability to offload directly to object storage. And there's a few demos in there, so it's not just complete slides that are just going to say that what we're doing. We're actually going to show you some of those scenarios, and it's very closely linked to that ransomware story, that security focus, insider threat protection, etc. Okay, so what is ransomware? And this is not new. Like, we may have only been really hearing about the topical side of ransomware over the last 2, 3, 5 years, but actually ransomware has been around for many years, for as long as I can remember being in computers. But now there's this added benefit of global currency, Bitcoin, etc., that allows you to go unmasked and be able to actually gain money from these ransomware bots or threats that are put into your data. And obviously they're getting smarter and smarter with how they distribute this ransomware or this malicious threat, whether it's through your NAS devices, whether it's through your applications. It's very much there, and it's a type of software that gets into your systems and starts spreading exponentially, and you may not even know it's there because the latest antivirus definitions, obviously they don't have it from day one or day zero. They have to actually learn, and then they can make the fix for that. So it spreads, obviously it encrypts. Generally speaking, for a very high 40,000 foot view of what ransomware looks like, it encrypts that file type, whatever that file type may be, and starts spreading across the network, very much like a virus. Which, in the current climate, that obviously we know exactly what a virus does from that point of view. So, from a Veeam point of view, we're not going to prevent you from getting ransomware. I think we were on another call a few weeks or months ago. Every day feels like a Monday at the moment, but ultimately we were talking about the threat of ransomware in general, not just specifically to service providers or enterprise customers. And we were saying how inevitable it was that this threat is real and it's just a matter of time. So how can we help prepare ourselves to be in the best possible position if we were to be attacked? And these are just 5 key points that, as Veeam, we would recommend our customers keep up to date with their infrastructure, their environment. And the first one being, well, let's keep everything up to date. That whole adage of Patch Tuesday, well, they're even more important now. They're there to stop these vulnerabilities, these backdoors that the threat could be coming in from. then also, let's not just open the firewall for everything, and let's actually perform tests and penetration tests against our environment and understand where there are holes or gaps, and then let's block them before someone does get in there and start manipulating our files and important data. There's a huge thing about education, being able to, it's not just us as IT people, we generally do understand these threats and these attacks and these vectors that they're coming in from. We've got to train the wider staff, the wider community on what this does, what this particular strain does, and we've got to arm them with the ability, well, don't open those emails if they don't look legit, and they're very good at making them look legit. But so it's very hard for us to train those people that are not potentially IT savvy along these lines. So obviously we would say this is our game, is back up that information every day. But there is an important part of that is, well, we need to have regular restore points so that we can recover not only from ransomware, but there are other infrastructure problems as well that Naresh kind of touched on in the first graph, where there's some information from ESG. They touch on different attack vectors or different failure scenarios, and that's still very much an apparent issue out there today. And the biggest one of all, and I recommend them the 4 and 5, we should be doing this at home as well with our IT at home, is back up the information every day and make sure that you've got a copy of that outside of your house in a different location, offsite, air-gapped completely in a secure location. That could be tape, it could be a USB drive that is sent to a different location, is it just outside of your house or ultimately outside of your business, or again, could be offsite in maybe a service provider's environment. So if anyone is new to the Veeam story, obviously we've been talking about the 3-2-1 methodology for a long time. And what we mean by that is 3 copies of your data. One of them is going to be your production. One is going to be a copy of that data as close to the production as possible for really fast recovery. But then one of them needs to be offsite in that secure offsite location. Again, that could be tape, that could be a service provider offering some storage as a service, backup as a service, DR as a service, but ultimately 3 copies of your data on 2 different media types and one of them being offsite. That air gap, what do I mean by this air gap? So air gap traditionally would mean something like tape or offline storage that you're going to only ever add to on a schedule basis, and you're going to merge, or you're going to collect the information from the latest backup, you're going to merge it with the existing that's already on that air gap solution, and then it gets plugged or unplugged from the system again, and you've got an air gap copy. In the same vein, this could be, as long as it's not accessible, we don't want it, so I can't, from a Veeam service provider point of view, I can't go to a UNC path and get to my backup repository that is being hosted by a MSP, and that's one area that we can start to help protect those failure scenarios or those attack vectors. Another way is we're moving data here, there, and everywhere at the moment. Our customers are generally moving data from on-premises into one of the public clouds, potentially coming to an IaaS solution that you guys are offering, and back again, and vice versa. Well, that's a lot of movement, whereas maybe traditionally we were only really concentrating on our 4 walls. We were only really worried about the data coming in and out, whereas now this data can move, and it's much more of that data is moving. The workloads are potentially going up into the public cloud or to you guys to burst for a workload at the end of the month, and then it's coming back. So one of the things that we implemented at the beginning of 2019 was our Secure Restore. So Secure Restore is the ability to actually integrate with antivirus software and make sure before that data gets restored, whether it's a direct restore into the public cloud, direct restore into VMware or Hyper-V, then it's got the ability to run a scan against the integrated antivirus software. So we're going to take that back up, we're going to mount it to an isolated server called our mount server in an isolated environment. We're going to trigger that antivirus check. If nothing is found, happy days, we're just going to continue with that restore process. And like I mentioned, so ESXi is mentioned here, but this could be any of our restore scenarios. Let's say that we've got a bigger team and a security team, and we've got the choice to, okay, an infection was found, but I still want you to proceed with the recovery. I want you to recover and continue with that, but I want you to disable the network adapter so it doesn't spread that virus out anywhere. It ultimately puts it in lockdown and doesn't allow it to get out of that or into the network. Because then your security team can come in and they can divulge what's happened, and they can hopefully remediate that as well. Now, if you're in a much smaller environment and you are the security team, as well as the backup admin, as well as the infrastructure guy and the cloud guy, then you probably don't have time. So maybe if you find an infection, then I just want to disregard the process and we'll go back to another one, or we'll work out another restore scenario that we can use. So there's a few other terminology that we use, and I've already kind of mentioned around tape being one, which was the kind of the ultimate, and that's been a tradition for backups for pretty much forever, is, well, where do we store that offline air-gapped copy of that data? Well, tape has always been, it's been there for a very long time, so it was always the de facto, it was always the go-to. We've also got the ability to replicate our VMs. Again, service providers could offer disaster recovery as a service, where we replicate virtual machines from production on-premises site into the service provider. Means that the customer doesn't have to, or they potentially don't have access to the disaster recovery site until they absolutely require it. Another big one, and this has really been around the adoption of object storage and the growth of object storage. It's no longer just about file, and it's no longer just about block-based storage. Object storage has not only a huge future from a backup perspective, but also from a application standpoint, being able to store your data there. But from a backup point of view, it's a great medium type to be able to store that, and in particular where we could leverage immutability. And we don't just mean immutability at maybe a bucket level, we mean down to the object, because it's the object that we don't want to be moved or modified or changed or encrypted. Whereas at the bucket level, everything within that, okay, everything is now locked, but it's not as granular, it's not as protective as going down at the object level. I already mentioned around Veeam Cloud Connect backup, so MSPs leveraging backup as a service and being able to store those backups for their customers. And I kind of touched on this more so for a home use, but I know there's some SMBs also doing this, where they're using USB or rotating hard drives as that offline media type that they want to store that data to. So we've got lots of options. It's just about determining what the best one is for your customers. So just switching gears and to kind of touch on a bit more about the whole embracing of object storage. So we've always been passionate about looking at what's next, what's coming down the line from a technology standpoint or an innovation standpoint. And we've seen over the last 2-3 years really that the object storage is becoming just as powerful, if not more powerful, than your traditional NAS and SAN type storage offerings, especially when it then comes to that object immutability. And let's get into a little bit more around that. So we have a feature in our product called capacity tier, which enables our customers to offload or tier their backups into this capacity tier, which ultimately could be AWS S3, it could be any S3-compatible storage, Microsoft Azure Blob, IBM, etc., but being able to leverage that infinite amount of storage. And especially if they're using that object lock API, which Cloudian is, that gives us the ability to, they're immutable. So even the administrator, even the storage admin, the backup admin, they cannot delete. And that's one of the demos that I'll show shortly, is that, if you hit the immutability lock or the object lock on a particular backup file, that cannot be modified. It cannot be deleted from the system. So just a bit of a refresher, if no one's aware of what I was talking about there, using the terms performance tier and scale out backup repository, this is really just going to paint out a picture. So what you see on the screen here is our scale out backup repository technology. So We have our DAS, NAS, dedupe, ultimately bring your own storage. This is on the customer site. This is what we're going to do is we're going to take all of those different extents, and that could just be one extent, and that's going to form something we call a performance tier. And this is where we're going to keep that short-term retention, that 7, 14, 30-day type retention for really, really fast recoveries. And then we've got the ability to tier off. Now we've got two modes when it comes to the capacity tier. We've either got copy, so as soon as it lands on the performance tier, we're going to automatically copy a version of that file into the capacity tier. Or we've got move, so based on a retention period, the performance tier might be I'm going to keep 14 days in my performance tier, and then I need to keep a copy of this data for 30 days. So after that 14 days, we then drip the 15th day into the capacity tier. And that's where that S3-compatible, the Cloudian, etc., the Amazon S3, that's where that comes in. It's all policy-based, transparent. You set what your requirement is on the backup job, but you also set where you want to keep that storage on the actual scale-out backup repository. And again, we'll show some of that in the demo. This is an important slide because I want to show just the differentiator that we have here, because we don't just take that massive backup file and send that into object storage. We chunk that down into much smaller chunks, and we send that up into a more object-orientated way of being able to store that data in object storage. We have our metadata that tells us what those blocks are, and we also send that metadata into object storage. If you're ever going to lose the on-premises, that performance tier that we touched on, then obviously we don't want all those chunks of data in object storage to be unreadable. So we also send the index or the metadata into the object storage as well, so that you could just use Veeam to rehydrate all of that data. So the immutability that I touched on, so it's really just a simple tick box as you're adding the object storage repository. Again, I'm going to show this in the demo. So, and what we do kind of hopefully already makes sense is that on the left-hand side, you see the performance tier. This is where we're going to keep our backups, and you see that we're using a copy mode up into the capacity tier. We're locking those files, and we've got a retention or an immutability lock for 3 days enabled. So as you can see, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are all locked. We get to Thursday, we lock it, but then we release that last day. So if we jump into the demo, as you can see, I've got 2 object storage added. If I just jump into the immutable one here, if I run through, we give it a name, we use our credentials that gets us into that. You can see this service point. Now, in particular, this is being hosted, well, Adam's actually hosting this in their lab at Cloudian, simulating very much like a service provider would. So I've got the credentials from Adam. I then choose my bucket that I've been given and provisioned. I can set a consumption, and I can say how many days I want this to be immutable for. And that's it. Now I've got access to be able to store my backups in object storage, or at least tier them to object storage. Because then what we're going to do is we're going to take that immutable bucket that we've just added, we're going to take that performance tier that you also see there, and we're going to create a scale-out backup repository with our performance tier and our capacity tier. And if we jump in here, I'll just quickly run through what this looks like. So again, we give it a name. We choose our local performance tier, and this is where we're going to keep that short-term retention. We choose a policy of where we're going to store that data. And then this is where we extend out to that scale-out backup repository with object storage. And that's where you've got that copy and move mode that I mentioned, and you can have them both simultaneously on. When do you want it to happen, etc. You can also encrypt it, which is strongly advised. If it's leaving your environment, then obviously we would advise that to be encrypted. And that's it. So then what we do is we go into our backup jobs. I'll just let this catch up. But ultimately what you see here is, from a service provider point of view, I can offer out our own S3-compatible storage as a way of being able to enable our customers to copy that data to object storage as a service. So in the backup job, you saw we just quickly run through there. I've got my scale-out backup repository that I'd already created. I'm going to keep it for 7 days, etc. run through the application consistency, run a schedule, and that's going to send that data over to that capacity tier. Now you'll see that the job's already been running, and if I now go in here, you'll see that I've got those disks or those virtual machines are being stored in that object storage. You saw on the left-hand side, I selected object storage. If I now try and delete these as a malicious insider, I have no access to that. Well, let's hope anyway. I should run this, and that immutability that I'd set, that object lock API that I've enabled, should not allow me to delete any of these backups. And it should ultimately tell me that I can't delete them because of the immutability lock, which also means that no one at the service provider layer side can delete them, but also no one from this side. So insider threat is also a big key feature or differentiator that we're able to prevent here. So the second piece was a big feature in version 10 that was released, and that was our Veeam NAS Backup. Veeam NAS Backup was a massive missing part of our ability to back up the new environments, but also legacy and workloads that we couldn't touch before. And without going into too much detail around NAS Backup, but ultimately we had an advantage in a way because we could see what the world was doing with their data, storing a lot more of it, and it was growing exponentially. We've all heard that many times on many different webinars. But we also knew that not everyone's storing it in one particular protocol or serving it out as one particular protocol. So we knew we needed to be a bit more flexible with what we brought to market. And we're never going to just tick the box in terms of, oh, we could do it with an NDMP-based solution. We want to be different, and we want it to be and actually change for good the way in which people protect their workloads. So firstly was the flexibility of being able to protect not only SMB and NFS, but also there's a lot of people out there that will be using Windows file servers and Linux file servers, and it's really an option there. We've obviously got our agents and we've got our virtualization way of being able to protect those, but this is another option to be able to protect those workloads. The biggest differentiator for us is around change file tracking. We've probably all heard of change block tracking, understanding what's changed since the last backup. This is exactly the same, but for files. This means that incremental is ever so fast. It means that we don't have to walk the whole file system. We just literally understand what's changed since the last backup, and then we pull those files into our backup. And then lastly is around snapshot friendly. There's a lot of NAS devices out there that supply or have a good storage snapshot technology solution. Well, we should ultimately be able to use them. So that's what we implemented, was the ability to use those native storage snapshots as our source so that we don't have to contend with file locks, etc., and offloading the performance down to that snapshot. Recovery-wise, and this is the big kicker against NDMP-based solutions, was being able to restore to any location. It doesn't have to go back to its original location. Being able to do specific point in times, which is what I'm going to show in the next demo as well, I think. And then file level recovery. Obviously, we want to be able to not only universally search our NAS backups, but we also want to be able to get really granular in being able to recover certain files and folders. So why do I bring this up on an object storage webinar? Well, we've got the ability, we have that same concept of a short-term retention for really fast recovery, but then we also have this long-term retention. Now, this doesn't have to be object storage. I'm sure the guys at Cloudian would prefer it to be object storage. And ultimately as well, it makes more cost-efficient sense to push that to long-term retention in object storage, simply because of the cost per gig. It's a cheaper solution. And what this does is this will archive older versions to that cheaper object storage. So just to put that into perspective, so short-term retention, we've got file 1, file 2, or file version 1, file version 2, file version 3. We're keeping 3 days on our short-term retention. File version 1 gets dropped down into our long-term retention. And this is just simulating that an ISO never changes, but it also allows me to say that this is what the internet's for. No one should be really storing gigs and terabytes of ISOs, but that will not come out of that short-term retention until it's deleted from source, and only then will it drop down into that long-term retention. So from a NAS point of view, now this doesn't support the immutability because it's that longer term retention, it's a file version. So, but that's okay because we're going to use the same bucket, but we're going to use a different folder within that bucket. We're going to use the same credentials. It doesn't have to be, it could obviously be separate, but notice how I'm not going to tick that make recent backups immutable for X amount of days. And also we're not going to create, and we're not going to push that into a scale out backup repository. Now for the short-term retention, NAS can write to a scale out backup repository, but we will ignore the capacity tier rules there. But when we go into a NAS file backup job, and we go into here and we go down to storage, here you've got your short-term retention on top, and then you've got your archive repository, so your long-term retention there on the bottom, and in particular I'm using that one that we just walked through. And we can do things like exclusions. We can, that alert that just came up was around location tagging. So if that data is leaving your premises, you should know about that, etc. Now, from a ransomware point of view, to bring it back on to the whole ransomware story, we've got the ability to go into our files and folders here, and we can explore not only what we have in the short-term retention, and remember this is in Adam's environment, this is not in my lab. So what I can do is I can look at our latest, so that's the one that's going to be in that short-term retention, but I can also look at all time, so all of my recovery points. If I look at this particular text file, this box cutter, you can see here that I've got 2 versions in my backup location, but I also have 2 in that archive location. And granted, that's just a small text file. It's not going to take very long, but this is going to come over the internet and it's going to bring that back into my production. It's going to overwrite what I already had there. But what it's going to do is it's that longer term retention. And again, this is where a service provider can take advantage of that by having the ability to offer an extension of a customer's storage, leveraging object storage as a service. Because we, as Veeam natively, there is no MSP way of being able to protect and store that data directly in like a Cloud Connect or a backup as a service type offering. So you can see there that we restored that very, very small file, but we brought it back from object storage, not in the local environment. Obviously it would be really quick locally as well. So then finally, before I hand it back and let Adam discuss a bit more around the Cloudian side of things, is the final thing around, there's been a massive surge, and this is actually Veeam's fastest growing product to date, is Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365. So SaaS-based, being able to protect those workloads. And we're now on version 4, and version 5 will actually be announced tomorrow or Thursday at Veeam On. With some new features there. The big important part here is that in the last version, in version 4, which came out just this year, was the ability to back up directly to object storage. So what do we actually mean by that is actually, well, we're going to keep a cache and a local bit of metadata on the actual VBO server, but we're actually going to offload everything to object storage for actually all of our backups. So from a service provider point of view, what does that look like as from an architecture point of view? So, okay, so on the left-hand side, you see Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365. You see that we protect Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. We can also protect on-premises Exchange and SharePoint, and we can protect them into that object storage directly. We can put it still to local storage if your customers wish, and there's definitely a service provider model around this. In particular, S3-compatible. You see the same object storage offerings that we have within Veeam Backup and Replication also highlighted here. And then from a recovery point of view, we have our Veeam Explorers for Exchange, for SharePoint, and also for OneDrive. And that's actually one of the demos that we're going to run through here. So here we are in the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365. If we go down to backup infrastructures, here's where I've added that S3 backup repository. You see there's the list of the options of object storage type, that same service point, and don't worry, without the IP address, you will never be able to get into that. The bucket in which we're going to store it to, we can also limit the object storage consumption if you're going to charge on a quota-based system. And then we go and create our backup repository using that object storage repository. So this is where we're going to keep that local cache, and then we're going to offload our backup data to object storage. And again, we can encrypt it. And then this is where the retention policy comes in, either item or snapshot level. There's a bit more of a deep dive. I've just done a YouTube video. I'll see if we can get the link to that. That goes into a bit more detail around what that looks like. So if I go in here as the backup job that I've created, I'm going to back up my mailbox. I'm not going to exclude anything. And I'm going to use that backup repository that we just created. I'm going to run it on a schedule, simple stuff. And you can see down the bottom that the last backup job was successful and it worked, no worries. Now to bring it back to a ransomware story, here you can see that I've got my OneDrive. I'm going to open this and you can see that the file is all good. Readable, images look good, but like everyone in lockdown, you need a project. So I wrote some ransomware that allows me to encrypt all of that, because what else are we going to do? So what this is going to do, you're going to see that it's going to encrypt all of those files. Over on the right-hand side, you probably just saw that date modified. Now, if I go and open that same file, it's a little less easy to read, or it should be. So obviously we've simulated a ransomware attack on our OneDrive. That's already, you can see that that's synced up into my main OneDrive. This is obviously just simulating a client. So we obviously need to restore that and get that back up and running as fast as possible for our users. So using the Veeam Explorer for Microsoft OneDrive, bearing in mind that our backups are living in object storage on a different site, completely away from, well, Microsoft's data centers, but also this lab, we're going to overwrite, we're going to bring everything back. I've got to remember my credentials. That's the only thing I should need to do to get back up and running. And what this is going to do is this is not going to restore everything to this client machine. It's going to restore everything back into the OneDrive component of Office 365, and then it's going to sync back to the client that way. So this is about, I think there's about 34 files that this is going to zip through, but again, you'll see the date modified. They're all changing because we're syncing them as they get changed in the main OneDrive instance. We're then pulling that data down on our client. So as soon as, and I think it's typically the last one that syncs, is that top blog. I should be able to open that, and we should see the good text and the picture, there you go, and everything's back up and running. Because, as I said at the very beginning, ransomware is very real, and they are getting smarter about where they attack. OneDrive has been a big threat recently, so has NAS Backup, and obviously image-based backups are also a big threat, because we generally have a lot of those in our environment. But really, there's three use cases where, from a Veeam perspective, as a service provider, you could base around additional services to enable your customers to leverage object storage at probably a much more cost-effective footprint. And I think my key takeaways before I hand it over to Adam would be object storage. I've already kind of alluded to it anyway. This is going to be the future of where we store our data. I've already said it's a first-class citizen in comparison to NAS and SAM for certain workloads, backup being one of those. I've already said as well about some of you will be using or offering backup as a service, DR as a service, and this is going to give you another service opportunity to be able to offer immutability or potentially object storage as a service. And they're the three demos that I touched on. So I touched on the capacity tier, which is part of the scale-out backup repository. I touched on the NAS backup for the long-term retention, as well as the direct-to-object storage from a Microsoft Office 365 point of view. With that, I'll hand it over to Adam. I'll still drive the slides, but yeah, any questions, drop it in the chat, and we'll get through them as we go.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers, Adam.
For a nice, clear overview of your solution there. That was great. If you could just move me on to the next slide, please, that would be great. really just kind of approaching the same message here from the back end angle. And first thing I'd really like to do is just give you guys a bit of an overview as to what Hyperstore actually is and what it does. So if we could just move to the next slide, please, Mike. In essence, we are effectively a scale-out, software-defined, S3-compatible storage platform that looks and feels like AWS S3, sits behind your firewall and operates at a better price point. I don't know if the slides actually move there, Mike. If you could just jump us onto the next one. Yeah. So yeah, we're a scale-out on-premise S3 object store. We can start fairly small with around about 100 terabytes of usable capacity, and effectively scale that solution up in a very modular fashion, which obviously increases the amount of capacity that you can take advantage of. And as you scale the solution out, it also increases the amount of performance that system can deliver. So we can start small, we can grow virtually without limit, as we're not constrained by some of the limitations that we find with block and file. And in addition to that, we also have a number of hybrid and multi-cloud features, so that enables us to actually move data to the public cloud if we so choose to at a very granular level. If you could just move me on again, please, there, Mike, that'd be great. So one of the main differences between Hyperstore and some of the other object vendors out there is very early on we made a bet on S3 becoming the de facto standard for object storage. And over the years, this has proven to be a good bet and really has become the de facto standard. And one of the things that we do differently when you compare and contrast this to some of the other vendors that are out there is we do S3 natively, and every node in our cluster, and a node is effectively a server, can service an S3 request. So we don't have gateways, we don't have a proprietary API that converts S3 into the proprietary API. We do everything natively, and we offer the most complete and extensive support of that standard outside of AWS S3. In order for a vendor to say that they do S3, really they only need to do the basic operations, which is like a get, a put, a list, and a delete, so like a read, a write, and a delete. When actually, if you look at the number of API calls, there's over 90, and we support pretty much all of them, and it's not a gateway. So Mike, if you could just move me to the next slide, please. And scalability. So yeah, this is one of the main differences, as I've mentioned already, when you compare us to block and file, is because of the structure of object storage. Every time we store a piece of data, whether that's an object or an asset, we associate some metadata with that object, and that's actually stored independently. So it's a flat structure, and we don't have any of the limitations that you have with block and file, and you can effectively just keep adding storage nodes into the solution. You can grow into additional data centers, and as you add additional nodes in, not only do you get more capacity and more performance, but you actually can take advantage of different protection schemes that are either more redundant or more efficient depending on what you're looking to do. And of course, we do this in a very cost-effective manner. We're really designed for the unstructured data, and we're all about driving, high efficiencies at scale. If you could just move me on again, please, Mike. He's my driver today. If you look at our kind of architecture, as I've mentioned, it's kind of a peer-to-peer mesh. Every node within the system is running all of our core services, and you'll see this in the demo that I'll run to show the back end of what Mike was showing. So we don't have any of the bottlenecks that, again, you can associate with some of the scale-up type solutions. This is really a scale-out offering. And when you hit a node in our system, you're only ever a maximum of one hop away from the data. So we can have different types of hardware underpinning this. We are a software-defined solution. You can choose to run appliances, which you can buy from us, or you can consume software only and effectively run this on your own hardware. And you can mix and match in between the two. So we're very, very flexible in terms of the way that we can deploy the solution from a hardware standpoint, And we're also very flexible in terms of the different sort of topologies that we support. And in fact, Mike, if you could just move me to the next one there. I think it's the right slide that's coming up. Yeah, this kind of shows the different protection schemes that we support. So in this demo environment that you'll see in a moment, and what Mike's been writing his backup data into, we effectively have a 3-node cluster, which is really our entry point. And with a 3-node cluster, you're kind of limited to what you can do. We do what we call an RF3, a replication factor 3. And that means that for each object that gets written in, let's say it's adam.jpg, each node, which is effectively a server, will get a copy of that object. If I lose 2 nodes, I've still got a copy I can recover from. So we're away from the world of RAID. We're into the world of RAIN, which is a redundant array of independent nodes. And we're kind of doing this on the fly. So we're not pre-provisioning, formatting RAID sets, groups, drives, pools, whatever. We're doing this as the data comes in. If we look at the top right of this slide, we talk about erasure coding, and this is similar to RAID 6. In this configuration, we're looking at 4+2. In this instance, I can lose 2 of those 6 nodes, and I'm still able to read the data back. So it's a lot more efficient than the RF3, but I do need 6 nodes to do that. If we look at the bottom left-hand side, replicated EC, it's effectively the same thing as single-site EC, but we mirror this across 2 data centers. So here, I can lose a data center, and I can lose 2 nodes at the surviving DC, and I'm still able to read my data back. So out of those 12 nodes, I can lose 8 of them. That's a bad day in the office if I lose 8 out of my 12 servers, but I've still got enough fragments there to actually read the data back. So we're all about very, very highly durable data protection, because ultimately, if we are the single source of truth, we are the archive tier, we are providing that worm-based functionality, then we need to make sure there's enough redundancy in the system to tolerate multiple hardware failures, site failures, et cetera, et cetera. So Mike, if you could just move me to the next slide, just in the interest of time here. One of the things we do really well, in addition to S3, is we have a number of multi-tenancy features. So again, talking about the messaging here for service providers. There's a number of things we do. We have role-based access control. So service providers can pre-provision group admins for tenants that can basically self-serve. They can also enforce quality of service limits, which can be done for tenants for that service provider, or actually, if we have multiple applications on our system, we can enforce some limits around, how much and how many resources those applications can consume. So you'll see in the demo in a moment, for Veeam, I can limit the amount of throughput that application can actually use. We have chargeback reporting, as well as a number of security features, which I'll come on to very quickly. Mike, if you could just move me along, please. And we're pretty simple to manage. So we have a nice GUI. It's all web-based, and you'll see that in the demonstration. So I think we can skip over this slide as well, if you don't mind, Mike. So yeah, different deployment models, whether it's software or hardware, it's entirely up to you. I've kind of covered this off already, so we can jump to the next slide. And usually, if I had more time, I'd probably go through a slide for each one of these features, but I'll just touch on a couple of them. I've talked about the different protection techniques that we can take advantage of. One of the nice things about Hyperstore is we can set these up at the bucket level. So you can have one bucket that's mirrored across 2 sites. You can have one bucket that's doing erasure coding. You can set the location affinity. So again, this is great for service providers that don't want to use the big, bad, evil American public clouds, and they want to keep data, say, in Germany. That's absolutely fine. You can actually control that by creating a policy that limits the placement of that data based on how many nodes and where you actually have them deployed within the system. In terms of multi-cloud and hybrid, we have the ability to move data into the public cloud. We can even run in the public cloud as well, because we're software defined. So if you wanted to take advantage of S3 and Azure, you could actually spin up some virtual instances in Azure and provide a gateway into Azure Blob. So I'll move quickly along to the next part of the presentation, and I'll go quick through this because it's really just retouching on what Mike has already talked about. So Veeam now supports S3 as a target. This has been in their product since version 9.5. Let me just move to the next slide, please, Mike. Really the way the solution works for the backup and recovery piece is we sit as basically a secondary target for the primary sort of landing zone for the backup data, which is typically that block storage or that SMB storage, which is connected to your Veeam backup and archive server. And then we basically function as that scale-out backup repository that Mike talked about. So we're able to move aged and that potentially more infrequently accessed data off of the expensive primary storage and onto a cost-optimized capacity tier, i.e. Cloudian Hyperstore, with the ability to then, if we want to, actually move data out somewhere else. So we're showing AWS, GCP, and Azure on this slide, but it might actually be to another service provider, and you'll see that in the demo. So if you could just jump to the next one, please, Mike. So really from a back-end point of view, this object lock feature that Mike talked about is really part of the S3 standard. It's something that AWS implemented, and we were the first object vendor to offer support for this. And it's true certified worm, which is write once, read many. It means that once the data is in that bucket and that policy has been set, short of you getting a sledgehammer and some very large magnets and physically destroying the servers that contain that data, it's protected and it cannot be deleted. It's effectively immutable. So if you jump to the next one, Mike. So Hyperstore, over the last 12, 18 months, we've really hardened our solution. It's really been a year of certification. We've got our common criteria certification, our FIPS 140-2. We're on the Department of Defense approved vendors list, and the key one here that we're talking about is worm, and this is the Sarbanes-Oxley Section 17A-4, and there's a really interesting document out there if you guys want to read up on this, but it's truly certified, it's real worm, and it's effectively a hardened solution where we restrict access, so there's a secure shell in there. You, as an admin, you can't actually delete any of the data. You have to wait for the expiry of the object. So if you jump to the next slide, please, Mike, and we'll just rattle through these quickly. We've already talked about this, and Mike's demonstrated how this actually works in the demonstration there. The point is, if you do get compromised, the backup target where you're storing that backup data is immutable, so you always have a clean copy for restore, and you can get back to operations very, very quickly. Jump to the next one, please, Mike. Just mindful of the clock here. So we talked about Office 365 protection. Mike's done a tremendous demo there. As he mentioned, that can go direct into object. And if you just jump to the next slide for me, Mike, because you've covered all of this off. I think one of the key differentiators here is when you look at doing Office 365's backup with block or file, one of the limitations that you have is around kind of the number of backup jobs you can actually create, which typically wouldn't be an issue for most customers, but service providers could certainly start to bump up towards this limit. And you basically don't have that limitation with object because of the way that we store the data. We don't have that limit, so as such, we're potentially a better fit for service providers that are looking to roll this out as a service for their end users. And I think there's one more slide before we jump into the demo, if you could just move me there. And again, Mike's covered it up, just to reiterate, we can function as that capacity tier for the NAS Backup, that archive repository. So again, for longer term retention, you can keep the data from your NAS devices in object storage in that highly durable, efficient protection technology without the risk of compromise and having hardware failures that can effectively damage your data sets. So if we just jump to the next slide, I think that's going to take us into the Cloudian demo, and I'm just going to give you a very high whirlwind tour of our interface here. So this is our dashboard, this is our landing zone, and it shows how much capacity we have in the system. It shows our consumption trends over time, gives us some information around how the system's being used. And if I click on cluster here, you can see I have 3 hexagons. These are effectively my cluster nodes. And you can see down the bottom of this screen, all the services are running on all of the nodes, as I talked about earlier, so a peer-to-peer mesh. If I drill into one of these nodes, you can actually see what's going on. Typically, there'd be more mount points here, but as these are VMs, we only have a couple of mount points for the data, but you can see, again, all of the services that are running on this particular node. If I drop into storage policies, you can see the policy I have in place at the moment is the RF3, which is where we're doing 3 copies. But just to show you, if I create a test policy here and specify the number of data centers to, say, 2 or 3, this will show me the different type of protection technique that I can set up for the buckets that I want to store within the system. In addition to defining where I want to keep the data and how I want to protect it, I also have controls around consistency. So whether I want to do strong or eventual consistency, who I want to expose these storage policies to. I can do compression on these storage policies, not relevant with Veeam, and I can also encrypt the data from the S3 bucket as well if I wanted to. Now, just to show you the user that Mike was running his demos to, this is the Veeam user here. When he was setting up that scale-out backup repository, he used some security credentials. So this is the AWS access keys and secret keys. These are actually provided from the Hyperstore system. As I mentioned in the slides there, I also have some controls around QoS, so I can set limits around how much throughput this user stroke application can consume within the system, as well as how much capacity. So if a tenant buys 5 terabytes, then I can set a limit for 5 terabytes. This is the bucket that Mike's been writing into, so you can see the folder structure here. There's the capacity tier, and then you can see the structure on our side. Now, effectively, you won't actually see any of the files because it's in Veeam's proprietary format, but we can see the data that's being stored within the bucket. If I go and create a test bucket, just to show you some of the features we can set at the bucket level, drop into the properties here, you can see we have access control lists, just like AWS. We have some canned ACLs. We can actually go in and we can set a lifecycle policy. So this is where we control the tiering. If I wanted to move the data into, say, the public cloud, I can move data to Amazon, to Google. I can do this, at a fixed point in time after a predefined period of inactivity. And I can actually send that data to any S3 endpoint. So it might be, again, a service provider that I want to tier this data to. Once the data has been moved, we basically stub it. We leave some metadata on our system, or we can actually keep a copy on our system for a predefined period of time if you want to. And then when you click to restore that data, if it's on the local system, it will come back from Hyperstore. If it's on AWS, what we'll do is we'll stream it straight back from the public cloud provider, or you can go direct into the AWS bucket and pull it out, natively. We don't put it into any proprietary format. Also on the lifecycle side, we can set an expiry rule. So if I have some compliance regulations where I need to expire the data, I can do that through here. I can also replicate the data to another region within my Hyperstore cluster. And I can enable versioning as well, which is a bit like Worm, but it's not fully immutable. I still have the ability to delete the data if I have the correct privilege, if I'm an admin in the user. Also in our system, we have a built-in S3 client, so I can upload data into the bucket just using the web interface. I can pull it back down. If I go into the properties of this particular object, I can actually provide a URL link. If I wanted to share this file out externally, I could say 5 downloads, and then I get a Dropbox type link that I can send externally. So just showing some of the other features that are available within Hyperstore here. Another area I just wanted to touch on very quickly, again, with a view of service providers looking at this. One of the nice things we can do is we can actually go in and create what we call a rating plan, which is kind of like a chargeback reporting engine. And I can assign costs for the different type of S3 operations that I want to do. So in terms of storage consumption, I can set some rules here that say for the first 50 gig, it's going to cost 5 pence per gig. When we get up beyond 50, but before 100, I'm going to drop to 3 pence per gig, and so on and so forth. So I can build out my own Amazon-like rating plans and charge more for egress than ingest and things like that. So just wrapping up the interface here, just showing the analytics view, just gives me a bit of information around how we're using the system. I am going to drop into our HyperIQ monitoring tool in a second just to show you how that fits together. This is just our capacity explorer that really gives you some insight as to how the system is being used, where you can drill down into the various different components, as well as being able to spin off a number of different reports. So again, if we look at the Veeam user and I look at the granularity over days, I can see how much data Mike is storing on our system, and I'll send him a bill in the post a bit later on using the chargeback mechanism that I talked about earlier. So that kind of brings us to the end of my whirlwind tour of our main interface, the CMC. Just very recently, we've introduced a new product which is called HyperIQ, and this gives us a lot more insight as to what's going on within the system. So a lot more granular, deep dive information as to how those nodes are being utilized, what's going on the drives themselves, what's going on the network. And the real kind of beauty here is all of this information is stored within a database. It allows me to basically specify a specific time range. You know, if I want to look at a specific point in time and find out what's going on, I can drill in and see what's going on. And, you know, obviously that can help with troubleshooting. It can also help when I want to look at things like this. I want to look at, you know, who my top users are within the system. So who's really hammering the thing, what the top buckets are, how the system is being utilized from an S3 perspective, and I can actually go in further and actually drill into, you know, the type of API calls that are being used on the system and some of the trends that are taking place. So it's a very powerful monitoring tool. As I say, it is fairly new. It's only really been released in the last couple of weeks, and we're going to add a lot more functionality to this over time, but hopefully you guys can see that there's quite a bit of power and a lot of flexibility in terms of what this particular tool can deliver. So with that, that's me done. I'm going to wrap up now, and I'm going to hand over to Stephen Seagrave from Evros. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. And thank you to Michael as well for the really detailed demonstrations as well. Thank you. So moving on to somebody who's actually implemented such a service, as we introduced Stephen before. Maybe, Stephen, thanks for bearing with us, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Evros, what your main business is, and, you know, are there any particular markets that you focus in on or verticals?
Yes, no problem at all. Thank you, Naresh, for having me on. Evros, as the largest Irish MSP, provide a full stack of services to our customers. We cover everything from full managed IT service desk right up to professional services. And we also, along with that, offer our own hosted cloud environment, brand name Digital Planet. And that's where we provide our customers with all of their hardware, software, hosting, cloud needs, as well as professional services and software services through other software provider stacks. And that's where we utilize services from providers such as Cloudian and Veeam there.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And what is the scope of the infrastructure in terms of the number of data centers, the way you're structured? I think that might be on the next slide, if I'm right.
Yeah, so we can move on to the next slide. So Evros have, I suppose, 4 offices, 3 in Ireland, and we've opened up our Follow the Sun model to Auckland and New Zealand in the last year. We currently host several thousand VMs across our data centres. We have 6 data centres covering 3 countries currently, Ireland, UK, and 2 in the US. And this allows us, I suppose, to provide services to our customers across Europe and the US, where we will be hosting Cloudian and Veeam.
Okay, great. And your customers, are they facing many challenges? What is it that they often ask for?
I suppose in today's climate, the main concern is security, and as obviously we've touched on throughout this webinar, ransomware protection, where data mutability is key, but also protection from disgruntled employees, phishing access into data from outside for malicious reasons, and also, I suppose, scale and cost. So for a long time, all of our customers have been looking for a solution that would provide, the ransomware security to provide air gap as an alternative to tape, but at a cost and scale that makes it worthwhile. I mean, the current explosion of data and the migration to the public cloud, and people using services like Office 365, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Exchange. Customers understand more and more the need to protect their data, and while it's all very well having your data in a public cloud, it's all in one basket. So our customers are looking for the capability to move that data out of public cloud and keep their air gap copy of their data in a closer place to home, like a service provider such as ourselves, where we can host an S3 storage solution for them and use Veeam Backup for Office 365 and the likes to store that data and keep it for them outside of the public cloud. And I suppose that's where we find that the solution of Veeam and Cloudian steps in to resolve that issue.
Okay, thank you. So that actually asks, they leads me to the question, why Veeam and Cloudian? Why in combination did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, Evros have been a long-standing Veeam partner for many years, and I suppose the decision was primarily based on security as a feature set. But as I said, along with cost and scalability over the lifespan of the solution, we needed to implement a storage solution that over the period of time we expected to keep it would provide, a good return on investment, but also provide our customers with the feature set that they want. As I've said in the blog I publish on evros.ie, the combination of Cloudian and Veeam to deliver object storage in a scale and cost-efficient manner is effectively the holy grail of backup storage. As a solution architect, my job is to look at the technologies available to the market space. And being a vendor-neutral provider, we offer solutions from many vendors. And as I said, my job is to find the best that I can propose to our customers. And stand over as a provider, and that's why I suppose we have decided to invest in Cloudian in partnership with Veeam to offer our services based on this. And I think as customers get used to using this storage with immutability, it will become the de facto minimum of what people will expect. People have been afraid to move away from tape. They like their tape. They like to physically see it and touch it. And they've been afraid to move away from tape because of, they might get the cost in one way. They might be able to find a storage that's cost effective, but it wouldn't be secure. And then they might find something that's very secure. There are some very secure solutions on the market, but they're incredibly expensive. So to get it all in one solution, and also then to have Veeam integrate with it at such a level where it's simply from the Veeam UI, you can select your object lock duration. That's a usability that's the customers really enjoy, and I suppose it drives why we use that combination to make us stand at the forefront of technology.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. So we do have a few questions from the audience as well. So I'll go through them one at a time. So first question, I guess, is to Michael. Can customers using Veeam pick those immutable options for Veeam Cloud Connect, or is that only for object storage?
Yeah, it's only for object storage. I was just zipping through those, yeah. And this is really the differentiator, right, is that as a service provider, you may be offering backup as a service, and your customers are protecting those workloads in that manner. But the ability to offer additional services with object storage, that's really where this comes in, and adding that additional protection layer of immutability as well is really where that's aimed at.
Okay, thank you. And I guess the question for Adam here is, can Cloudian run on top of a vSAN storage?
Yeah, I was just looking at that one myself. Yes, so basically, in a short answer, yes, we can pretty much run anywhere where you can deploy a Linux server. Although the consideration here is, we're all about driving cost efficiencies at scale. So if you're running on top of virtual infrastructure, then you probably got RAID underpinning that, and then if you're doing an RF3 on top, you're going to dilute some of the efficiencies that we bring to the table. But certainly for a test, POC, absolutely 100%. The other thing I would mention on the VMware side is we have a partnership with VMware through the VCPP program, where we basically fit into their stack as effectively vObject, and there's a technical integration point there with an object storage extension that allows VCD customers to actually provision S3 storage that's sitting on Hyperstore through vCloud Director. So yes is the short answer to the question.
Good, thank you. And then open question is restoring Office 365 mailboxes onto OneDrive or from OneDrive and choosing the overall options. Do we need to know the login credentials for all users to make the restore happen successfully, or is a master account for the customer exchange server required?
So no, we don't. As a backup admin, no, you don't need to know every single credential. One of the things that we've been working on from our side and working with Microsoft in this regard is using service accounts to be able to protect. So very similar to service accounts that you have on premises when you're looking at things like SQL or Exchange, that exactly the same premise is there for Office 365. So you would have a service account that has access to the data that would allow us to back it up, but also then be able to restore it as well. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, excellent. So we're coming very close to time now, and I just wanted to thank Michael, Adam, and Stephen for the time today and for the demos as well to our audience as well. So please do visit us at Cloudian.com, at Veeam.com, and also Evros.ie. With that, I'd like to thank you and wish you the really good rest of your day, and hope you have a great evening for those in Europe. Thank you, everyone.